to What About Design? On today's episode, we are going to discuss some very interesting things about the history of design. And as usual, with us is Frank Myong, our graphic designer and friend. Thanks for being here with us, Frank.
Hello, it is always pleasure to be with you.
So, we discussed mid century modern, and in the previous lecture, I discussed the way design became a simple tool for selling consumer goods from a very powerful and very courageous way of designing and a very novel way of dealing with design, art, and trying to change society through design. Design became in the United States only a tool, an instrument to sell things in the 50s. And this is what I discussed previously. Now, things were and are about to change because nothing stays in the same place forever. We saw that designers were somehow the first ones to see that it is important to use art to change society. And if we think of the futurist experiment that was conducted by Marinetti in Italy, or we think about Russian constructivism and how important it was, and what a creativity just erupted when artists were finally left to their own devices to create. We also have to think about the Bauhaus, and even though it closed down in 1933 when Nazi came to power and they associated it with the Weimar Republic, but still it was such a powerful and creative artistic experiment that basically influenced the whole century. Now, in today's lecture, we are going to discuss something very interesting, the 60s, the 70s, and we are going to see that uh, a lot of things are going to change in design. Because if the 50s were dominated by advertising and by this idea of using the universal visual language of modernism to sell consumer goods, this time around, design was going to be used to sell ideas, to sell artists, to sell poetry, to sell different things, and it was used in a way that had nothing to do with the consumer goods and consumer culture values. On the contrary, as you may see and you may understand, design is going to be used to challenge that order. And for the first time, this thing was going to happen in the United States. And design was going to be, along with other arts, a tool of expression of those who are not in favor of consumer culture, of militaristic culture, of a society that was very prone to impose very strict gender rules. So I think you are going to enjoy more this lecture, since it is about a moment in recent history when the youth and the artists went against the status quo. First of all, some important things before going into pop art and psychedelia, to give some historical context. And I always give this, I don't know what is the situation in Poland, and I would like you to tell me, or Bulgaria, where you studied. But unfortunately, in Romania, and this is where most of my students are enrolled, in Romania, history suddenly ends in 1945. We learned some things about communism, then about the revolution in 1989, and history stops there, unfortunately. People do not learn important things about recent history, about things that happened after 1945. So I don't know what is the situation in Poland. Do history books, I mean the ones that are used to teach history in schools, and in 1945, the story of the world's history end there?
You know, the last time I went to school, it was like 30 years ago. So I don't know how is the situation now, but according to the media and to the mainstream in Poland, the history of Poland starts in 1939, when when the Nazi and also the USSR invaded Poland. So at the same time, I don't know, are you aware of this? I mean, the post-communist era is actually the era that is constantly is associated with negative emotions towards socialism
Mhm.
period. And they say that everything bad that happened to this country was there, was then, and that the country, I mean, Poland was, like a colony of the USSR. So of course this is not true, but there is a couple of bad moments in the Polish history. For example, in 1968, the then Secretary General of the Polish Communist Party, Gomułka, expelled the Jewish people from Poland. I mean, like, not he not expelled them like go away, but there was a whole program. And the funny thing is that his wife was Jewish, and actually she arranged, like marriages, between the uh, party prominents and Jewish people. So it was, like tremendous way of going through
Backwards.
again, yeah, to this, this phase of
Dark
the
time of anti-Semitism.
exactly, yes, 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 yes. And a lot of them right now, to just to say they changed their I mean, their family names, or just like
Uh-huh.
they went incognito. But in Bulgaria is exactly the opposite. I mean, like, Bulgaria has this moment where uh, Dimitrov, he was the leader of the international, how it is in English,
International.
international, yeah, the international organization of communist parties. And actually he was one who was blamed to set the Reichstag in flames in 30, I think, five, I'm not sure. And he got to the court and he won. But never mind. So at the beginning, the beginnings was very hard. I mean, like, of the Bulgarian socialist country. But later, the 60s, the 70s, actually the 60s and the 70s was the golden era of the Bulgarian state, like like the communist state, and people remember that. And actually, what they have now in Bulgaria cannot compare to that period, and they are missing it. You know,
Of course, we are not allowed to say it, and this is, it's very hard to go against the official propaganda. And they are still very confused when they take like polls and surveys and see that a lot of Romanians would choose actually Ceausescu today. And they took surveys and they said that he was a great leader. And it is not, my opinion is not that he was great, but the disaster that followed was so dramatic and deep that he seems great in comparison to the tragic events that followed. But nevertheless, I wanted to give my students some background, and thank you very much for sharing this information with us, because I wanted to give a little bit of historical background, because in my opinion you cannot understand the history of design and art without
Sure.
understanding the history of events in general, because art is not some separate activity that happens on Mars. It's happening on Earth, and it's pretty much related to the events that happen here. So in 1953, a very important event, Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba. Now, in 1948, the People's Republic of China is formed. In 1962, we have the Cuban Missiles Crisis. The Soviets wanted to install nuclear missiles in Cuba, and there was an international conflict. And there was this time where we went very near to a very important confrontation, militaristic one. Now, I would say that the art of the 60s and the 70s was not at all as homogeneous than the modernism of the 50s. We saw the modernism last time, and pretty much, if you look at the advertisements or if you look at the art that was created back then, it was pretty much homogeneous because modernism was so widely accepted, and also due to the efforts of the Museum of Modern Art. In the 60s and the 70s, um, there was this desire to challenge the status quo, but there was no an ideological dominant and an aesthetical one. So, as I said before, modernism in the 50s became the language of corporations. The Russian constructivists wanted to make out of it a way of of making art appealing to the public, of bringing the people closer to art and opening this field to the public, and wanted to make it democratic, and also the Bauhaus, because this is why they insisted on efficiency. They did not insisted on efficiency because they wanted to sell consumer goods, but because they thought that uh, art must take a more humble stance in front of the public, and it had to be more inclusive and more modest. Now, consumerism became the target of criticism by graphic designers. And Modernism, because it became the criticism, the target of criticism, became only a way of expression among many others. It was a moment where various subcultures were formed, because various groups found their voices and found their ways of expressing their discontent, their revolt against a society that imposed a very narrow ideal and very narrow perspectives of what does it mean for a person to be happy. I would say here it is very important to note that it was the time where psychoanalysis and also important psychological theories found their ways up to the elites, because there is a very perverse mechanism that went on here. And I will try to briefly explain it. A lot of people were shocked by the horrors of the Second World War. They were shocked that millions of Jews, some say 6 million, died in concentration camps, let alone the ones that were killed outside the concentration camps. So, how was this possible? How was this possible? And unfortunately, instead of thinking that it was the system that allowed ordinary people to become murderers, the American elites found it more appealing to believe that it is something deep inside each and every one of us that makes us potential killers, you know. And you may not find this to be very important, but it is. Because what is the source and what was the source of that evil? Only 4% of the population is born with brain defects or with very important psychiatric diseases that lead to psychosis and very, very serious mental problems. There were not the 4% that killed all those millions of Jews. There were ordinary people. So what makes ordinary people go crazy? What do you think?
Propaganda.
Of
I mean,
course,
like there is this, those subjects you're talking about are extremely complex, and I'm afraid one lecture will not be enough to
yes,
explain all of this. But in general, I want to say that there is something like it's called Gestalt psychology. That means that put in one situation, in one room, everybody will react the same.
no, but the idea and the point that I want to make here is that we are not by ourselves potential killers.
Of course not.
What makes us go crazy is the whole social context. But instead of focusing on that, unfortunately, the elites focused on, making people adapt to society and treating their own citizens as potential beasts, and that is very problematic. And this is why certain subcultures were formed and they were started to rebel because this perspective never challenged the social reality. It expected citizens to become very well behaved and obedient consumers and not challenge the status quo. And they were not able to keep it that way and to keep the social control for a long time because people of color, women, all sorts of minorities started to fight for their rights and started to challenge the status quo. That status quo that was based on the idea that actually Bernays created, because you mentioned propaganda. In 1938, he published this book, Propaganda, where he expressed this idea that the consumer has to be king and the citizen has to become consumer, and consumerism is a way to maintain the status quo and the social control. And they listened to this. And basically, what is also very important, besides the fact that a lot of people started to challenge the status quo, was also the fact that the television was also a thing and it started to become more and more popular. And it also changed the way people were relating to power, to political power, to everything around him. This is why in the 58, this very famous quote that the medium is the message, that was proposed and it was suggested by Marshall McLuhan in his book Gutenberg Galaxy. Now, pop art is a very important moment, and I would say it's somehow something that laid and created the basis for postmodernism. It debuted in the mid 50s. It was led, it was not led actually by designers, but it was led by architect, painters, sculptors. And it was also criticism of the designer that stays in a very neutral position and describes the world. Now, pop is linked to the intention of designers of integrating a lot of styles in their work. They were no longer prone to accept this idea of, the very efficient and very simple language, visual language based on simple geometrical forms that modernism was advancing and suggesting. And they wanted to experiment with a lot of sources of inspiration. And one of the most important sources of inspiration was the street, the living, people living just their daily lives. As I said, pop culture is often seen and considered for this way of trying to find multiple sources of inspiration as making the transition to postmodernism. And as I said, a lot of people find it very interesting, and especially in Romania, since we are so, you know, attached to the idea that the United States should not be criticized and that basically the Western society is an ideal. I don't know what's the situation in
Yeah,
Bulgaria,
the
and I
same.
would like you to tell me is the same, but I
Uh,
would say that maybe it's not just the same as in Romania, because you still have some people that are more prone to Russia and are more open to,
okay,
because let us not forget that your language resembles a lot Russian, and you have this type of community and makes you closer to that.
Mhm,
Instead, for the Romanians, Russian is Chinese. So
mhm. Well, actually, all Slavic languages are, that is called mutually intelligible. So that means that if somebody speaks a Slavic language, like Romanian, right, you can understand French and Italian and Spanish. I would say that about 60% maybe of the dictionaries of these languages are actually identical. So, but historically, the Bulgarian language is the oldest because it was the oldest written form of a Slavic language in the history because it started in the 9th century, even much before other languages were European. I mean, languages that were in written forms, like for German or I don't know, Spanish or French and stuff. So this was also the time that this language went to Russia. And actually, most of the Russian scholars are saying that, the Old Russian or the basic of Russian is actually Old Bulgarian, which is, Old Church Slavonic, which is Old Bulgarian. Anyway, so this is the connection, I mean, between Bulgaria and Russia. And of course, Russia was one of the factors that, helped Bulgaria to gain its independence at the end of the 19th century, because actually Romania had very also big role in this because most of the Bulgarian revolutionists were based there in Brăila and in Bucharest also. But what is important here is that of course there are people who and of course Bulgaria paid later. Bulgaria paid until the 1918 paid to Russia tribute. I mean, like in money for this independence. But anyways, of course there are people who are close to the West, I mean, to the Western view, and they are very close to the United States, to the Western conception. And there are, of course, people who are close to the Eastern conception. So Bulgaria is a very hard case because there are
as
three main
in
like
Romania,
yeah,
I
three
know
main,
that.
like powers who are behind all of this. In Poland, the situation is much simpler because there are also people who are like Catholics, like they pretend that nothing else matters than the Catholic Church. Also, they're pro-Western, and the left is very weak there. I mean, here, I mean, because I'm in Poland very weak. The flame of the left ideas is, like invisible because of the church and because of the Western culture. And because historically, as I mentioned before, Russia, I mean, the Soviet bloc, the USSR was one who invaded Poland in 1939, and the Polish people do remember this very well.
Well, now it was a movement against consumerism and militarism. So it was a movement against this military industrial complex that we keep hearing about. And in 1961, what is also very important is that the US government launched an invasion of the Gulf of Pigs, a military operation that was aimed at overthrowing the Cuban government. I told you about the Cuban missiles crisis in 1962. Finally, Nikita Khrushchev agrees not to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, this is the whole setting. The anti-war protest was a big, big event that meant that a lot of artists were galvanized around this event and wanted to express their anger not only against militarism but this specific war that was raging, and it was taking a lot of the lives and resources of the United States. And it was a conflict that basically brought together two parts of the same country, but they were supported by the two competing superpowers, the USSR and USA. Now, the idea is that a lot of people thought that, look, maybe we lost the Vietnam War on the streets in Washington. And they were saying that because a lot of people started protesting against the Vietnam War, against militarism, against this perspective where you have to invade other countries to impose your own agenda. And the pacifist movements and the strong criticism of consumer society began and were also galvanized by the books and the works of what we call in our introduction to media studies the Frankfurt School. Not only designers were forced to flee Europe because the Nazi came to power, but also a lot of important intellectuals like Herbert Marcuse, Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno. They were the ones that formed the Frankfurt School. Why do we call it that? Since they all developed and they all wrote important books in USA. Well, because they met and they had a common philosophical and common research program that was announced in 1929, where they formed the Institute for Social Critique, not social criticism, and it was then that they started writing. They had to flee, but the idea remained. And in 1964, Herbert Marcuse publishes a book that is very important. It is a harsh critique of the American society, and it became like a book that was read and used by a lot of the people that protested that type of society, the one-dimensional man. And it criticizes the mass culture and the alienation, the three forms of alienation that also Marx discusses. Uh, Alienation from your work, the products of your work, even that in design, you know, if you're not Graphus, like the one collective of designers that was formed in 1968 and wanted to create only designs for the causes that they believed in, or you are not the adbusters that wanted to do the same thing. In general, even in design, if you have your products, they are being taken away from you, you know. And this happens all the time. You have no control over your work. You go there, you stay for 8 hours, you produce something, and that is being taken away from you at the end of the day. Now, this creates a form of alienation. I would say it creates a form of alienation between you and your work, between you and the nature, because the nature becomes in this mad quest for profit some sort of resource that is only there to be exploited. And we are seeing to that the results where that leads to. And then the alienation of man from man, that is the idea that we are alienated from one from another, since there are multiple reasons. But just think how people are willing to buy, you know, clothing, even though they know it's been produced using cheap labor in the global south, and actually maybe children and simply don't care. They buy it anyway because we are so alienated from those people and we don't care. And these are the three forms and multiple things he discusses there. Now, this critique, as I told you, led to the formation of collective of designers, and that had a very that rebelled against the order, the social and the status quo, and that laid also the foundation of postmodernism. Now, what we are going to see right now is that almost all the designers that were famous during this time and that I'm going to present actually used their talent to sell something else than consumer goods. And it is also the case of the French designer Massin, who was very much in contrast with the current trends, and he wanted to use design as a tool of selling or of promoting, so to speak, books. He became famous for designing the bold prima donna cover, that is a famous play by Eugen Ionescu, that is a Romanian born writer that emigrated to France, and he had there a very important career, and it is recognized as one of the most important theater um, um, playwriters. And this is the cover. He was interesting also in suggesting the dramatic tension and the fact that the lines became more tense, they overlap visually. So, and he became famous for this and other book covers because he worked for a lot of years for as an art director of Gallimard, that is a very important publishing house in France. Now, another important school of design that was formed, Push and Pin Studio by Milton Glaser and Seymour Chast. They were students of Cooper Union in New York. It is interesting that a lot of designers in the United States went there to study. And basically they wanted to, I want to show this. This is an ironic, this is a poster that uses irony and uses the methods of postmodernism. The idea that you take a famous symbol, I think you recognize this, isn't
Yes,
it?
Uncle Sam.
Exactly, and uses a very powerful image of a well-known symbol and uses it to make fun of it. If you go closer here and you look at what is here, it says "and bad breath." It is a poster by Seymour Chast that it was created in 1968 as anti-war. You see here planes dropping bombs on houses. So it was quite the opposite if you think of how design was used to make people enroll and to convince them to um, enlist, and to go to war. While this is, first of all, it has some sort of political message. uh, it uses important and very powerful symbols and images, and it just twists a little bit their meaning by this simple ironic touch. And this is very postmodern because postmodernism is famous for using this type of techniques. I mean, having some sort of social message, using powerful images that we already know that already colonized um, our imagination before, and it just twists a little bit the message to convey a completely or an opposite type of message that the initial poster symbol or image relayed. Now, Milton Glaser is also known for working with Mary Wells Lawrence to create this I Love New York logo. And basically, it is very interesting that this happened also in Graphus. He went to work for a lot of magazines, but Seymour Chast remains director at Push and Pin, and he wanted to promote this type of social causes and ideas. They split. They formed this together, this Push and Pin studio, but at some point, Melton Glaser went on a separate, went his separate way. Now, as I told you, it is an era where you would find designers gaining their popularity by designing posters that were relating to books, as Masson designed the book for the cover for The Bold Prima Donna, and now Milton Glaser designing the poster for Bob Dylan. And what we are seeing here is the Art Deco style, where you have these very thin black lines between the colors that is being used basically to sell the cover of this album. So it is a completely different story that we've discussed so far. And it is so nice basically that design was open and it was given opportunities to become famous in different areas than advertising. And music and covers, album covers were a big thing. I want also to discuss this designer, Herb Lubolin. He studied at Cooper Union, and he designed pharmaceutical products. But what is important is that, as many other designers and designers in the second wave of American designers, abandoned functionalism in favor of expression, and he remained known for a special typographic style. He was also involved in the protest movement and helped to publish magazines that were edited by Ralph Ginsburg, that is a very controversial figure, personality in the USA. Even Andrea Dworkin wrote about it and lectured about an encounter with Ralph Ginsburg that was accused of promiscuity, and he was convicted in 1966. And just look here, what a nice cover. 1967, the cover for Mr. Tambourine. You will see here psychedelia, and this use of very vivid colors and the use of Art Deco and various sources of inspiration. You don't see, just think of the designs of Lester Beale that were used to sell, the the ideas of the New Deal in the United States. And look at this poster, this explosion of form, color, and it is the work of Martin Sharp. So we had the cover of Bob Dylan. We also have this cover, another hit by the same song, by the same singer, but another designer. He was also, this cover was featured on the seventh number of the magazine Oz. Now, this magazine is very interesting because a lot of publications started to go underground and to appear clandestinely, and Oz magazine was very important for the radical message. Also, the Black Dwarf, that was, it's also related to the name of Tariq Ali, that is the member and of the editors of the New Left Review. And what is important about Oz? Now, you can see here that they wanted to explore, especially in this psychedelia, with sexuality, with different forms of color, ways of expression. And you can see here, the same patterns that you might find in Art Deco, and sexually explicit material. And they wanted to use that in order to challenge the status quo. Just think of the images from the advertisements from the 50s. Have this in mind and tell me if you advertising from the 50s, and look at these images. Everybody's smiling, everybody's, so neat, and everybody has his own or her own special role. Look at this, you know and
It looks like
then
a Kama Sutra, like a Kama Sutra image. But actually, the
and look
style is
at this.
Japanese. The style is Japanese, I would say.
And they wanted also, yes, this is a very good observation, because they wanted to experiment with influences from the Orient, from India, from Japan. They wanted to experiment with different colors, different styles. and to break free actually from the very narrow um, rules of society, of design, of art. Because as I told you, modernism, the question would be here, well, they had modernism. Why would they wanted to break free? Because modernism was actually transformed into something very oppressive and something very narrow. So of course they wanted to break free, because all those advertisements and all those posters were very modern in form but not in content, you know. So this is a perfect expression on the way they wanted to break free from all that. What is also said, and I want to say it, and I just pasted here some of the um, explicit nudity, and you can see, you know, I think they were among the first magazines to use women of color as models for their covers. But unfortunately, they used, then the establishment was not happy. The establishment was not happy at all, because, you know, these things keeps repeating itself over and over again in our history. You have all these people that are not, you know, in public they are saints, but of course in private they are not saints, so to speak, to say the least. I mean, we had that Joseph, what was his name?
I know what you mean. The Hungarian, yeah. Mhm.
The Hungarian ones.
From Fidesz, yeah.
Yes, so this happens all
Schabenhaar.
over again, you know. Uh, so basically, Koyer or something like that was his name, Joseph. So he was caught in a gay orgy, and he was climbing down the chimney from the house. It was so ridiculous, because there are only two types of hypocrite conservatives: the one that were caught and the one that were not caught yet. And of course, the establishment used actually a law that was written in 1839 to accuse them of
Fire.
pornography.
Fire.
Sire. Okay, sire. And they accused them of using pornography, and they made them shut down the whole magazine. It was also a scandal, because at some point they invited students, underage students, to design one of the numbers, you know. And the students designs were basically cartoons, but they had the pornographic, or so to speak, explicit
Oh,
sexual acts were depicted in cartoons. And the establishment went nuts, and they found the perfect opportunity to go against them, even though, as you may imagine, in Soho, that is a very famous part of London, prostitution and pornography were flourishing. But for these people, the only thing is to pretend is not there. The minute you try to exploit it in art and you say, look, it's here just across the street, then they go crazy, you know, because they live in these very separate boxes. The private, which allows for all sorts of you know, pornography abuses and sexual exploitation and so on and so forth, and the public. And in
mm.
public we are
But
saints.
let me say something here, because right now we do have the same thing with the social apps that we are using. For example, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Actually, when you share a naked body, I mean, like your body, or I don't know, part of your body, you will be instantly banned that this is something bad, right? But actually, my friend found the whole profile of art pictures with everything in it. I mean, the sexual organs, and even, like provocative like this one, which is art. And, it's not prohibited. So, it's the same thing repeats and repeats and repeats, in history. But, my personal view of that is that everybody who saw a breast in his life. I mean, the first thing a person saw in his life was a breast. So it's nothing shameful about that. It's completely normal. So I don't know why people are doing such a big fuss about that. And of course, I know because of the church, because European culture is sexually oppressed. Because when you are sexually oppressed, you are constantly asking yourself, is this legal or not? Because
Mhm.
it's a culture of fear, actually.
Yes, I would say so. And basically, this is the story of. Now, I want to say that I find quite problematic the cartoons that those students draw. And you might find it online. I didn't put it here in the presentation, but I found it problematic because it was from a boy's perspective. And my suspicion is that there were boys invited to design those cartoons, and they were quite sexist. But, when you had flourishing prostitution and pornography in Soho to go after a bunch of students who designs, who draw basically some sexually explicit scenes, seems crazy, but this is the way the authorities work. I mean, we had here in Romania a huge scandal just a few months ago when a theater director was accused of encouraging to depravity because she actually is the director of a theater that recorded a theater play written by somebody else where they discussed abortions, and everybody went nuts. And it is so interesting that just a month after that, or a few months after that event, she found in the drawer of the ex director of that theater, the ex manager of that theater, she found a Playboy magazine, because you have to be very careful with what you say in public, but in private, you know, this is the important thing here. Not the content itself, but where do you display that? Now, what happened, because we are Eurocentrists,
Yeah.
we always discuss about Europe and what happened in Europe and the United States, and pretty much everything gets washed away. We are not interested in that. And it is the merit of Professor Ainslie that he discusses what happened in Japan and in China and in other places, and tries to see, design from a broader perspective. Now, in China, because as I told you, the students do not know much about it, China was divided, and it was um, faced a lot of challenges because they had an eternal war, a civil war, and also that was the World War II. And only after World War II, Chairman Mao Zedong, and his army of followers managed to gain control power and form the People's Republic of China. So they faced two important challenges, two wars. And basically, what I want to say here is that China is often, disregarded, and it's often looked with arrogance. And I think this is completely mistaken, because they have a long history, and the fact that we are ignorant doesn't mean that they are not important and they do not have an important history to be studied. So basically, typography was introduced in China 400 years before the Gutenberg invention.
I told you that, remember, in the
Yes,
previous.
yes, you told me. And they also had these, how do you say that, labels, on packages, they had
That
that a
label.
long time ago. And they also had a lot of things related to design, because they were very careful, and they were very, how should I say, diligent with these things. So what happened in the 20th century is that the Shanghai style was formed. That is a combination of Art Deco and traditional elements. And I have some examples that Professor Enschli also gave in his book. These are examples from his book that are representative of the Shanghai style. Now, since 1976, Deng Xiaoping came to power in China, and he was a visionary. He was a visionary because, why was he a visionary? Because unlike the Russians and the ex-Soviet bloc countries, he wanted to do business with the Western world. And that led to the creation of a very interesting system that is, the Communist Party rules China, but they have a very important economic exchange with the Western world. So the ones that are prone to be fans of capitalism say that China is now communist and not communist anymore, while the other ones say, look, of course they are communists and they are the living proof that communism can work. And they are also the ones that say there are some sort of state capitalism. Now, it is very interesting what happened there. I will only say here that he was visionary enough to try that on different parts of the country. And I think this is very important. When you try something new and it is quite a radical change, not to go full speed ahead and apply it to the whole country, but try it in separate areas to see if it works or not. Well, of course, that created a lot of problems.
Like the
Now,
Wuhan virus, the Wuhan virus. I'm sorry, that was a joke. Yeah, but, they tried it in the Wuhan province, no, not in the whole China.
well, they didn't succeed with
According
that one.
to yeah, yeah.
They didn't. Now, the second Polish
Wait,
designer, we have two from Czechoslovakia, because I'm very proud, So Roman Cześlewicz,
Levy. Yeah,
Cześlewicz,
yeah.
okay, and he was a disciple, of course, of Harry Tomaszewski. He designed a lot of posters for movies because, as you said in the previous lecture, they were not bound to use the initial and the original posters, but they were left to their own devices to create whatever posters they felt like it for American movies. Now, what is interesting is that even though he emigrated to France and he became designer at Elle magazine, he adopted an ironic critical style, and he took active part in 1968 protests. Now, those protests were very important. Almost 10 million people attended and protested in the streets of Paris. And it was a time where students and workers came together to find this General de Gaulle. So he was in power, and they wanted to get rid of him and also of American dominance, American imperialism, and so on and so forth. And so we have two people from the Czech Republic, and we have two from Poland. I think it is important for Eastern Europe. We have some people to be proud of, because they made it into the international arena of design. Now, what is also very important, and I like it a lot, and I think it would deserve a very different chapter, is what happened in Cuba. Because Cuba, they had their revolution, but what is interesting, and they took down the regime of Fulgencio Batista in 1959, and Fidel Castro came to power, but they did not apply the principles of realist socialism. And they took very serious this idea that they had to break free from the past and they had to get rid, of what they call the bourgeois art. And they had to find different ways of expression. And they wanted, and they were influenced by pop art, psychedelia, and also traditional elements. And as I told you, they did not adopt the social realism. And this is when this image, this iconic image of Che Guevara, was started to be a source of inspiration. If you go to Cuba right now, you see it all over the place, and it became this international icon. And now, of course, unfortunately, he was killed by the CIA because he went to Bolivia in 1967 and he was caught. Some people say that they cut off his hands, that they tortured him. Anyway, it was a tragic stories, and I gave here a link to a very nice movie that is the Motorcycle Diaries that tells the story of Che Guevara as a young man traveling all across the South American continent. And this is when he became, he became a revolutionary. But the film is so nice because there is no talk of the revolution. Simply he goes and he observes what happens there. Now, I want to end, in style with Grafus. This is a collective of directors that I specifically like. I already presented them in my first lecture. They were actually nicknamed or they were smeared as Stalinist scum or crapule stalinien. So because they were designers, as I told you, one of them, Gerard Paris Clavel, remained true to the cause. And throughout his life, he only designed things for theater companies or causes, social causes that he believed in. And Pierre Bernard and Gerard Paris Clavel, they worked together for quite a while, but unfortunately in 1991, this whole idea of Grafus Collective was abolished. And Pierre Bernard founded Atelier de Création Graphique. And he went to work for companies just like any other designers. But Gerard Paris Clavel founded Ne Pas Plier, Don't Give In, where he was able to follow basically his dream of not being, the servant of companies, and to use design as a tool to challenge the status quo, to criticize the power relation, and to help society progress. So this was basically it, my lecture for today. So thank you so much for listening to us. Thank you, Frank, for being here with us.
Thank you. Hope to see you again.
And I hope to see you all next time.